So with this brief lesson, I'm going to finish the chapter, The Resurgence of Conservatism, which I had begun with Ronald Reagan. So this is just the last section on George H.W. Bush, who is also known as Bush 41 because he's the 41st President of the United States, whereas his son, George W. Bush, is also known as Bush 43 because he's the 43rd President of the United States. So George Herbert Walker Bush becomes president after Reagan. He served as Reagan's vice president for both terms, and he has a pretty impressive resume when he comes to the White House. He was a World War II naval aviator. He was actually the youngest naval aviator in World War II, and he fought in the Pacific. And then he comes back to the United States after being a war hero. He was shot down, he received a Medal Cross, and he goes back to Texas and starts up an oil industry there and becomes a successful businessman. He then gets into politics and is elected to the House of Representatives in '67. So he serves in Washington and holds a number of government posts, including the director of the CIA. So he has a lot of experience domestically, but also standing at the side of Reagan on the foreign policy sector. He ends up defeating the Democrat rival, Michael Dukakis, and takes the presidency in 1988. His foreign policy is probably his strongest area. It is what he's most known for, and he is most successful in this field. Some of his more important achievements are early on in his presidency, obviously taking the inheritance that he has from Reagan. He is the one that actually oversees the reuniting of Germany and the fall of the Soviet Union, the ending of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. He's actually president when all these things come to happen in '89. So it's right after. This is all obviously the results of the Reagan administration, but Bush is the actual sitting president during this time. And he is able to solidify U.S.-Soviet relations and work with Mikhail Gorbachev, and they end up signing the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is a very important step in the reduction of arms and the ending of the Cold War and the restoration of peaceful and relatively friendly relations with Russia and the United States. And he proclaims this, what he calls the New World Order, which he hoped would be a world now free of the threat of terror and stronger in the pursuit of justice and more secure in the quest for peace. Basically announcing this New World Order after the fall of the Soviet Union. He also was the initiator of the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, which will then become ratified and signed into effect by his successor, Clinton, which we'll get into later. But he is the one that initiates these trade agreements between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, basically opening up free trade in the entire North American part of the world. He is also known for his international assistance programs, especially Operation Restore Hope, where he gave, through the military, humanitarian assistance to refugees in Somalia. He also ordered military operations in Panama to overthrow the dictator there who was threatening Americans and was highly involved in illegal drug trafficking into the United States. So these are his major foreign policy actions before we get to the most important, Operation Desert Storm, which is also known as the Gulf War. And this will obviously be covered extensively and perfectly by Costanza, so I will not go into this in great detail. Basically, they overthrow Saddam Hussein and they kick him out of Kuwait, essentially. But I will leave that to Costanza to develop further. And on the domestic front, we have some big pieces of legislation which he's able to get through are the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Clear Air Act. So this has to do with helping disabled Americans and environmental issues. Two of his Supreme Court appointments are David Souter and Clarence Thomas. And Clarence Thomas is still sitting on the court right now. David Souter has retired. His popularity was extremely high because of his foreign policies. Matter of fact, after the Gulf War, he arrived at a peak of about 93% approval rating. This is unheard of for a president. Usually a president should be satisfied if they have more than 50% approval rating. But occasionally, in particular moments, presidents have risen up in percentage, but never has a president arrived at a 93% approval rating as Bush did after his engagements in the Gulf War. However, America, not long after, is suffering an economic crisis or an economic recession. He had promised in his campaign slogan, "No new taxes, read my lips, I will not pass new taxes," which is one reason why he was elected. However, trying to face an enormous deficit that the United States was constantly increasing, he realized that to stabilize the economy, probably he was going to have to concede and raise some taxes in order to balance out the budget, which he ended up doing, costing him a lot of his support in his conservative camp. And at the same time, we see the rise of a young governor from the state of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who appeals to the American voters for a number of reasons. One, he's young, he's good looking. He tends to give the impression that he understands the common American, he understands their needs, and he is there for them to help them, and help them specifically with regard to their wallet, their pocketbook, their economic difficulties. Whereas Bush tends to give the image of someone who's a little bit more distant and who's more concentrated on foreign affairs and less concentrated on my, citizen day-to-day difficulties and my economic struggles. And so really the economy is probably the key issue that cost Bush the election. Another important aspect in this election of 1992, which would have been Bush's second term, but he lost it to Clinton, obviously, was the role of the third party candidate, Ross Perot. As you probably know, the United States basically has always run on a two-party system. Whereas in Italy, in order to get anything done, you need to have a coalition of parties because there are so many parties. In the United States, basically everybody boils down to two main camps. We do have a number of other parties that oftentimes can actually get onto the ballot so that you can actually vote for them in certain states. Rarely does a third party candidate get on all 50 states, their ballot, and even more rarely do they have enough support to actually participate even in the televised debates. Once the two-party candidates have been chosen, usually the debates are limited to only those two parties because they need to have massive support to even get in. Well, in this election, there were enough discontented voters who were undecided between Bill Clinton and George Bush that a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, was able to get on the ticket in all 50 states, and he was actually able to participate in the televised debates, which gave him an advantage of 19% in the popular vote, which doesn't seem that much, but it ends up taking a good percentage from both of the other main candidates, allowing Clinton to win the election with 43% of the popular vote and costing George H.W. Bush the election. So it was very important, the role of Ross Perot in swinging the election from one candidate to the other. And here I've put in a short timeline to give an idea of the events in the presidency of George H.W. Bush. Probably the most important event in his presidency would be the Persian Gulf War and the success of that campaign. Whereas probably his weakest point would be the economy, which ended up costing him the election. And I've put a short video out there for you guys to watch on George H.W. Bush. He, in general, is considered, I think, by both sides of the aisle. And when I say both sides of the aisle, it's an expression, you're speaking of the aisle in Congress, the aisle that divides the Republicans from the Democrats. So it's the passageway where people walk, right? The aisle of an airplane, the aisle of a movie theater. It's the passageway where people walk and divides the two sides. And so when people say both sides of the aisle, they mean the Democrats and the Republicans, or they mean the conservatives and the liberals. And both sides of the aisle, I think, consider George H.W. Bush to be a great man, a good politician, if you can put those two words together, and a role model with regard to a public servant. So he's highly considered by all, and his legacy, his presidency was judged by history as being a positive moment in American history, although, like I say, he suffered the criticism of his inability to handle the problems in the economy. And I will close with that. So that closes the chapter on the resurgence of conservatism. And then we'll get into a time of change with William Jefferson Clinton.